Sleepy little town, isn't it? This is Drogheda, 40 miles north of Dublin in the Irish Republic. It's a peaceful place with churches, historic buildings and a local museum. But a couple of years ago, when they opened a new exhibition here, the town erupted in angry protest. The centrepiece of the exhibition was the death mask of Oliver Cromwell, the famous English Civil War commander. And Cromwell, to put it mildly, isn't popular in these parts. Because it's said, in 1649, an English army under his command committed an act here that has become infamous in Irish history.
The enemy to the front! Give fire!
The stories I heard when I was young was of him coming to Drogheda and murdering the population, women and children.
He was a tyrant that came into Ireland and murdered a lot of people, and through school, that's the way I've been educated.
He's never forgotten for what he done here. It was brutal, it was a massacre, slaughter.
War criminal wasn't a word that was used then, but in today's context I'm sure he was a war criminal, yes.
But not everyone believes these stories are true.
I am totally convinced that there were no deliberate killings of unarmed men, women and children.
So was Cromwell really guilty of war crimes here at Drogheda?
It's a question of interpretation.
(1649) was a turbulent year in English history. With the execution of Charles I, the Civil War was over, but discontent was still rife. In Ireland, Catholics were rebelling against the English Protestant regime. Oliver Cromwell had led Parliament against the king, and by now he was the most powerful man in England. He decided to sort out the Irish problem. He took 12,000 men and landed in Dublin to crush the rebellion. His first target was Drogheda. Drogheda was held by royalist forces, and they felt confident of victory. Even today you can see why. The town wall was a big 20 feet high, 6 feet wide. In the words of the royalist commander, Sir Arthur Aston,
"He who could take Drogheda could take hell."
Charge your pikes and jaws!
Cromwell offered Aston a last chance to surrender. When he refused, a bombardment began.
The enemy to the front!
After 2 days, the walls were breached, and after vicious fighting, Cromwell led his victorious troops into the town. It's what happened next that caused all the argument.
Here's the story in Cromwell's own words, from a letter he wrote to Parliament a few days later.
Several of the enemy retreated to the Mill Mount, a place very strong and difficult to attack. The governor, Sir Arthur Aston, being there, I ordered our men to put all to the sword. Indeed, being in the heat of the action, I forbade them to spare any people who carried weapons in the town, and I think that night they put to the sword 2,000 men.
2,000 men.
A massacre.
But was it a war crime? Not according to the standards of the day. This is Tom Riley, a local historian.
The defending army knew by refusing to surrender the town that they could be killed, all killed, outright, within the rules as they then stood. And what happened here was Cromwell employed those rules, and he killed every man that was in arms that night.
So killing soldiers was considered okay?
But what about civilians? That's the vital question. This picture comes from a 19th century history book, An Illustrated History of Ireland, by Mary Frances Cusack, an Irish nun. Here's Cromwell in the background, overseeing the massacre of women and children. It's pretty explicit. But where's the evidence scenes like this ever happened?
First, evidence from Cromwell's own character. It's known he hated Catholics, Irish Catholics in particular, and he was cruel. At Drogheda, he ordered his troops to torch a church full of Irish soldiers. He listened as they cried out, "I burn, I burn." And if you doubt he'd do the same to civilians, there's another clue in Cromwell's own letter to Parliament. It lists the total casualties, and the end of the list reads,
44 captains, 220 troopers, 2,500 foot soldiers, and many inhabitants.
which means he admits it.
More evidence from supposedly eyewitness accounts. The first one's a history written by an Oxford scholar, Anthony Wood. His brother Thomas fought at Drogheda. He told Anthony how Cromwell's soldiers took up children and used them as shields to keep themselves from being shot or brained.
And here's another account, from an officer in the regiment of Sir John Clotworthy, part of Cromwell's army.
The Irish were all hewn down, no quarter given to man, woman or child, so that not a dozen escaped out of the town, soldiers or townspeople.
It's all pretty conclusive.
And yet still, some historians doubt it ever happened.
You essentially use the golden rule, don't believe all you read. If you have a source that says something, it's always good to have another source that substantiates it, that agrees with it.
So let's give these so-called eyewitness accounts a going over. Do they really stand up to scrutiny? Surely Cromwell's letter must do.
The main weakness with those three words, and many inhabitants, is that we have no proof whatsoever that Cromwell actually wrote the words. They come down to us in pamphlet form. The original letter doesn't exist. And it's detached, those words at the end of a list of those slain at Drogheda. And it's not actually proven that Cromwell wrote them.
So what about the account of soldiers using children as shields?
There's a big difficulty with Thomas Wood's account. He's the only one who gives us details of civilian deaths, but his brother actually wrote the account which came down to us. And both of them are known to be royalists, although Thomas changed sides regularly. So there's a lot of inconsistencies going on there, and it's a typical account that you would be very suspicious of.
And the officer in Sir John Clotworthy's regiment?
I have a huge difficulty with the account of the officer in the regiment of Sir John Clotworthy, because he wasn't even in Drogheda. He wrote his account in 1685. It lay dormant until 1873, when an Irish Catholic priest picked up on it, transcribed it, and admitted to filling in many of the blanks. So really it's not a substantial document to take evidence from.
So if there's no proof one way or another, how can we know what really happened?
We can't.
It's a question of interpretation.